Hello, greetings everyone. Apologies about the change in time this week if that inconvenienced anyone. And it may be that next week it'll be at this same time. Anyway, I'll let you know in advance. So this week we are reviewing or studying Svabodha-mañjarī, the blossoming of one's innate awareness, verses 17, 18, and 19. And first, let's just review verse 16 for a moment. So, verse 16, I will paste it in your chat window in a slightly different translation, not necessarily the final translation. So this verse 16 was a very important verse, the end of this little section on dharanas, or centering techniques, utilizing sensual objects that dissolve or fade away. So the summary verse of this little section is verse 16, which reads, "In precisely the same way, one may meditate on the beauty of the visible and other objects of the senses, the audible, the tactile, and so on, is what's implied here. After the object perception has dissolved, one should remain present with no memory of it, meaning without thinking on it, invigorated by the sense of one's own immediate being. Atma bhava upabrahmhita. Atma bhavopabrahmhita in Sanskrit. Invigorated by the sense of one's own immediate being, invigorated by or intensified by the feeling of one's own presence, the feeling of one's own innate consciousness. These are all different ways we could translate the same phrase. And my translation is in part inspired by that of Alexis Sanderson, who did not translate the whole text, but just a few selected verses from it in his monumental and magisterial book-length article, The Shaiva Exegesis of Kashmir. So now we're moving on to this next little section, which is about centering techniques that are not dependent on the objects of the senses, or that are less sensual, one might simply say. So let's turn to verse 17. In the Sanskrit, it reads, Evam grahya samaveshan nirodha katito maya grahana deva purvoyam idanim sampradrishyate. And this means, I'll paste it in the comments window for you. Thus, I, meaning Vīranātha, the author, have taught cessation through immersion into the perceptible. Now I will demonstrate that cessation which can take place prior to perception. So cessation is a rough translation of the word nirodha, which we also find in Yoga Sutra 1.2 as the very definition of yoga, the state of yoga. Cessation could also be, the translation could also be becoming completely still and present, still silent presence. That's the meaning of the word both in the Yoga Sutra and here. So he says, I've taught this nirodha, this still silent presence that is possible through samavesha, immersion into sensual objects, into the perceptible. And now I'm going to teach that that nirodha, which is possible prior to any perception, and not specifically connected to any perception. So now he's just introducing this next little section. Okay, so there's no practice here specifically, just a transition verse, that's all it is. Okay, so verse 18 reads, Grahanan indriyaniha samaniti prabodhayet samatvam ragahane syad dveshasyo pakshaya. And that means one should prabodha, awaken the senses, instruments of perception that are by nature equal to their objects. Instruments of perception that are samani, equal to their objects. This equanimity, samatvam, arises only when craving has been lost and aversion has wasted away. So the tenor of this verse will be more familiar to those who have studied classical yoga of the kind found in the Yoga Sutras. But yes and no, right? Because on the one hand, he's saying, awaken the senses, open the sense gates, be fully connected to your present moment experience, be fully connected to your real situation. So with sense gates fully open, you're perceiving everything. But what he's recommending is a specific kind of awareness cultivation or meditation, bhavana, that I also teach, and that in fact is the center or a center of my teaching in terms of tantric yoga practice, which is this wide open whole field awareness in which you gently practice resisting the conditioned mind's tendency to attach to certain objects of perception and push others away. Okay, so resisting is not the right word. Gently retraining yourself, I should say, to be present with everything equally instead of the conditioned mind's habitual practice of attaching to the objects of perception that it enjoys or craves or finds preferential, and pushing away those objects of perception that it finds unpleasant or aversive. Okay, so in this practice, you're simply aware of everything in the whole field of perception equally, which means all light and color, all sound, all sensation, all thought, all emotion, everything. And so what generally happens is when people just sit with themselves is they get lost in thought. They get caught up in the stream of thoughts and fixated upon them and lost in thought. So it is very much a practice, a disciplined practice, to be aware of everything equally instead of being lost in thought or overly fixated on the contents of thought or emotion for that matter, you know. So in this practice, which I sometimes call tattva bhavana, meditation on reality, you're just present with everything equally. So it's kind of like if you've ever done soft focus with your visual sense, like you're looking at something and then you just soft focus, meaning you relax your vision, you relax your eyes, you're even relaxing your visual cortex of your brain, and you're opening up to the whole field of perception, and you're aware of everything equally instead of singling out a specific object within that field. you're just as aware of what's on the periphery of the visual field as you are of what's in the center. So even though your eyes physically aren't perceiving anything different, there's a really important shift of awareness to that place where you're perceiving everything equally, that we could call soft focus or whole field perception. And here I'm just talking about the visual field. But in fact, you do this with all the sense fields and you don't even separate them. So you're aware of all visual phenomena, auditory phenomena, sensations, thoughts and emotions, but all equally. So you're still aware of thoughts and feelings, but no more and no less than you're aware of the sounds in your environment, however quiet, no more, no less than you're aware of the sensations in your body. And so this does take practice. We're not habituated to this mode of whole field perception. And it is powerful. It's a powerful practice. It really, really does over time create a paradigm shift and open you to non-dual awareness and non-dual perception. Okay, because you, among other things, you perceive that your own physical body or the sensation of a physical body is no more and no less a part of the field of awareness as everything else. And you start to perceive the arbitrariness of the mental construct of me versus not me. You start to perceive that everything in the field of awareness is equally the contents of consciousness. And so there's simply consciousness or awareness and its contents. And that's the only actual distinction that presents within direct experience, free of mental projection. So again, this kind of senses open, totally present, holistic, whole field awareness, I call tattva bhavana. Just writing that for you. It goes by multiple names. Okay, so once again, the verse reads, one should awaken the senses, fully awaken and activate, prabodha, the senses, which are instruments of perception that are by nature equal to their objects. Meaning, the senses, if they're allowed to, just very naturally meet their objects. It's the mind, the conditioned mind, that grabs onto this or that perception, whether thought or sensation or other object of perception, and the conditioned mind that pushes away and tries to reject, unsuccessfully, this or that object of perception. Again, whether thought, sensation, visual object, whatever. So he's saying that in their intrinsic nature, the senses don't grab onto or push away any object of perception. They simply meet what is. They're simply equal to what is, in the sense that each sense simply meets the sense field associated with it. And he says, this practice gives rise to samatvam, equanimity. And for those who are well-versed in the textual tradition of yoga, you immediately think of the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna actually defines the state of yoga as samatvam. He says, samatvam yoga uchyate, yoga is said to be equanimity. The same word. So, and of course our author knows that passage as well. So this equanimity, this samatvam, arises only when craving has been lost and aversion has wasted away. Now, this is not a state in which you try to make yourself be yogic and, yes, I have no preferences, artificially trying to create that state. It's nothing like that. It's nothing to do with that. He says when craving has been lost, when aversion has wasted away, meaning in both cases that raga and dvesha, attachment and aversion, craving and hatred, you could translate them several ways, have fallen away. And what causes them to fall away? It's simply the realization that getting more of what you think you want is not actually the path to fulfillment. That avoiding everything you don't like is also not a path to fulfillment. And when you realize that fully and start to embody that realization, naturally, craving falls away, aversion falls away without having to force it, without effort, in direct proportion to the degree that you realize that. And then you experience this delightful samatvam, this equanimity, this kind of inner state that is not dependent on the changing external circumstances, this inner steadiness and centeredness that, in fact, we all crave and hope that yoga can give us, rightly so, because it can. In fact, that's one of the, over centuries and centuries of the tradition, one of the main fruits of yoga practice that's repeated again and again, and not the only one, but this samatvam, this centeredness, this steadiness, this ability to kind of remain rooted in your own heart, your own core, heart in the sense of the core of your being, not so much the emotional heart, right? Okay, any questions so far? I'm not seeing the usual number of comments. I'm hoping that's not because of an internet problem on my end, but please do feel free to post comments and questions, and maybe you are, and I'm just not seeing them for whatever reason. But in case you are, I'll just mention I'm not seeing them. So we can move on to verse 19, unless there are questions or comments that are visible to me. Occasionally this happens where I only see the comments after finishing the video. Okay, verse 19, which will be our last verse today. Well, let me do the first half of verse 19 by itself. Sarvaragat sahani syat sarvadveshat tathaiva cha, which means abandon all craving and likewise all aversion. And actually, before I go on, I want to mention a parallel passage. So this is a very important feature of the study of Sanskrit texts, is that if you want to understand a passage you're looking at more deeply, you need to look at parallel passages in other sources. And so you need to be well read and widely read in the literature. And indeed, in Vīranātha Tantra, which is the most closely parallel text to the Blossoming of Awareness, we find this verse, number 126, which says, one should cultivate neither hatred nor craving in any circumstance. In one who is freed from raga and dvesha, attachment and aversion, the absolute unfolds in the center. So this is a beautiful verse, and the phrasing is very carefully chosen, I think, because it's not saying, get rid of your attachment and aversion. It's simply saying one should not cultivate either one. One should not feed one's attachment or aversion, one's craving or hatred. Those are just different translations of the same terms, raga and dvesha. So one should cultivate neither hatred nor craving in any circumstance. It's okay if they're there, but you don't give them any energy, which is very different from some other yogic lineages that are like, you must control yourself and you must crush the desires and so on. Those are actual terms that are used. And then he says, the text says, we're again in the VBT parallel passage, in one who is freed, has become free of attachment and aversion, which doesn't mean you don't feel attachment or aversion. It means that you're not bound to them. You're not a slave of your own craving, and you're not a slave of your own aversion, you know. So in terms of your relationship with your own emotions, in terms of relationship with your own life situation, in terms of relationship with people in your life, you're no longer enslaved by your liking for some and your dislike for others. You no longer make your happiness and contentment and inner state dependent on getting more of what you like and less of what you don't. So that's liberation. That's one definition of liberation, the goal of the path. And the text says, and one who is freed from attachment and aversion, the absolute, meaning direct perception of your real nature, of your fundamental nature, unfolds in the center, in the core of your being, in the madhya. So this is a very important parallel passage, which indeed our author might have had in mind in composing verse 18 and 19. So let's turn back to verse 19. So the first half is very clear and straightforward. Abandon all craving and likewise all aversion. The second half, however, we have what's called a textual problem. And so I just need to be technical for a moment, but it's really important that you guys understand this because, well, you'll see why. These texts were copied onto perishable materials, birch bark and Kashmir, palm leaves and in most of the rest of India, as well as other materials, all perishable. So what that means is after a century or so, they're decaying. You need to recopy them. And so the person who's copying it is not the original author, doesn't have the same stake in the text as the original author, may or may not be a disciple in that lineage, might be just a scribe, might be just even someone paid to copy it. Anyway, the scribe inevitably makes errors or in the process of copying. Maybe a few, maybe a lot, depending on the quality of that scribe. And so then that text is copied again a century later, on average, and so on and so forth, depending on the climate. So texts are copied a lot more in most of India than, say, in Nepal or other mountainous regions where they last better. So the more the text has been copied, the more errors have crept in. So what a scholar needs to do to repair these corruptions is compare manuscripts of the same text, different manuscripts of the same text. And preferably the different manuscripts you're comparing are not copied from the same exemplar, but have different manuscript lineages. In that way, you're going to see different errors in the different versions that you're looking at, allowing you to find the best readings and hopefully the original readings that the original author actually wrote. And sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes the manuscripts that you have, there's too many corruptions in a specific verse, and it's very, very hard or indeed impossible to know what the original author meant for that specific verse. If all your manuscripts agree, then you're very lucky, and there's no doubt. And if most of the manuscripts agree, but there's a few that disagree, you can be pretty sure that you're arriving at the reading, meaning the text written by your original author. And in some cases, like the second half of verse 19, you don't have that certainty. Italian scholar Raffaele Torella very kindly prepared a critical edition of this text, the Svabodha-mañjarī, and he was unable to solve the textual problem in verse 19. I'm unable to solve it as well because we don't have enough witnesses. So here's a couple of possibilities. None of them are satisfactory. So Buddhavat sarvaragi syat sarvadveshta cha bhairavaha. Now, on the face of it, this really doesn't make sense. Perhaps there's a reference that we're missing here that was known to readers at the time. But like a Buddha, be attached to everything. yet also be averse to everything, like Bhairava. Okay, so who knows exactly what's going on here, but it seems possible that the author is saying, let go of all attachment and let go of all aversion. And if you can't do that, then the best alternative is to be attached to everything and yet averse to everything. Meaning, if you can realize that everything it has value in a certain context and everything is valueless in some other context, then you can realize that it's not intrinsic to the objects of perception. Maybe that's what he meant. That if this state of being free of attachment and aversion seems to you not sufficiently embodied, not sufficiently passionate, then the other option is to go to sort of the opposite extreme, what seems to be an extreme from normal conditioned mind social standards, which is crave everything and yet despise everything simultaneously. So anyway, we know there's a corruption because it doesn't really make sense. The Buddha was famous for his equanimity, right? So it doesn't make sense to say, be attached to everything like a Buddha. What? Or and hate everything or be averse to everything, such as Bhairava. So I'm not confident in the reading. Torella's not confident. Nobody's been able to solve this as of yet. So another possible reading that Torella prefers is Badavat Sarvaragi Syat, like one who is bound. Crave everything like one who is bound, and be averse to everything. And then we just have the occurrence of the word Bhairava. Who knows? So what's important here, and we'll just end with this, is that most scholars, and especially most scholar practitioners, do not give their audience, their students, a window into the world of uncertainty in the science of textual criticism, So they and this is on the basis of Indian tradition, just in Indian tradition in general, a teacher or a guru is sort of not supposed to admit when he doesn't know. And so almost always a teacher in that traditional culture will gloss over these textual problems and even pretend they aren't there, rather than appear to be kind of fallible in their knowledge. And obviously, I hope by example, I'm expressing my view that I think this is problematic, if not actually dangerous. I think it's important that the teacher is honest about their own lack of certainty in any given case. So that acknowledging that we can't always be certain about these things, I think is an important feature of healthy pedagogy. Okay, so I could say more about that, but that's enough for this week. And next week we will continue with verses 20. Why did my brain say 9? Who knows? Verses 20 and following. Nice to be with you all. Sorry I didn't receive any comments. You probably made them, and I'll see them afterwards and respond subsequently. Om.